Hey, this is Jared Rathel, and I appreciate you tuning in to the first lecture in our second unit in Biology 182, exploring the bedrock theory upon which the biological sciences rest, evolution. In this lecture, I will be discussing the historical context surrounding Charles Darwin's profound idea. However, I'd like to start with this species on the right-hand side of your screen. This is the giant hawk moth. So it's endemic to Madagascar, found no place else. How it was described to science, discovered and described in 1882. However, the very existence of this moth was predicted 20 years earlier and some 5,700 miles away by Charles Darwin, as he sat in his London office and examined this Star of Bethlehem orchid with its foot-long nectar spur and the sugary solution pooled at the bottom. Darwin reasoned that the pollinator species, this hawk moth, had to have an equally long proboscis in order to access that nectar. What Darwin recognized is that these two species had exquisitely co-evolved. So the big idea that I hope you walk away with this presentation with today is that Darwin's theory, which he initially describes as descent with modification by natural selection, it's a relatively simple idea, but one that has profound implications. So he called it descent with modification, implying that species change, that they get modified as their lineages descend through time. Descent with modification by natural selection, meaning nature itself shapes lineages by selecting for those individuals with advantageous traits that help them survive and reproduce, and against those characteristics that do not help them survive and reproduce. Darwin's logical framework helps us understand where all these endless forms most beautiful, this biological diversity that we see all around us, comes from. Further, this idea implies that all life, from the giant Galapagos tortoise that you see here to that giant hawk moth, to us, are related. This is a deeply moving idea for scientists like myself, and it's a dangerous idea to others. However, before we dive into 19th century Europe and the historical context surrounding Darwin's idea, I first want to introduce you to the San Bushmen of the Kalahari Desert, likely the oldest culture on planet Earth, and one of the last to rely solely on hunting and gathering. Genetic studies using both Y chromosome haplogroups as well as mitochondrial DNA provide solid evidence that the San are the most divergent, i.e., the oldest branch of the human family tree. For more information, check out Spencer Wells' The Human Genographic Project. So the San Bushmen have a language that is radically different as well. They communicate using clicks. The San believe in a creator god named Kong, who made every form of life on earth and is the god of all natural things and all beings. The San believe that they used to live underground with all of the animals until Kong brought them all above ground. And this is their creation narrative, their creation story. In India, the Hindus celebrate Holi, an exhilarating festival that welcomes spring by throwing vibrantly colored powder on each other. It looks like a blast. I'd really like to do that, to be there. The Hindus also have a creation narrative. It goes, in the beginning, there was darkness everywhere. Everything was in a state of sleep. There was nothing, either moving or static. And then Sava Ambu, and forgive me if I mispronounce that, the self-manifested being arose, which is a form beyond senses. Sava Ambu created the primordial waters first and then established the seed of creation into it. The seed turns into a golden womb, and then Sava Ambu enters, and it is now an egg called Vishnu. Vishnu pervades the whole of the universe. So in these creation narratives, these stories, the imagery is amazingly fecund, right? Seeds and wombs and eggs, all these things associated with birth, with life propagating itself. China, the most populous country on planet Earth, 1 billion people live there. They have a creation story as well, and it goes like this. In the beginning, there was nothing in the universe except a formless chaos. The chaos coalesced into a cosmic egg. There's that egg again. Within it, the perfectly opposed principles of yin and yang became balanced, and Pangu, a giant, emerged from the egg. Pangu began creating the world. He separated yin from yang with a swing of his mighty axe, creating the earth and sky. This narrative, like all of these stories I'm going to share with you, have immense cultural importance. Undoubtedly is quite meaningful to many people, and I respect that. The Cherokee creation belief describes the earth as a great floating island surrounded by seawater. It hangs from the sky by cords attached at the 4 cardinal points, north, south, east, and west. The story tells that the first earth came to be when the little water beetle came from the sky realm. He scurried over the surface of the water but found no solid place to rest. He dived to the bottom of the water and brought up some soft mud. This mud expanded in every direction and became the earth. If you are Native American and were taught this story or another creation narrative, I am not here to judge you and what you do or do not believe in. So my wife and I lived out in the Hawaiian Islands when we were younger on the island of Maui. The Polynesians, the first peoples of the Hawaiian Islands, have a creation chant. It's 2,012 lines long, and it describes the occurrence of creation over 16 ages, or what they call wa. The first wa, in the first wa, the sea urchins and seaweed were born. In the second wa, 73 types of fish. In the third, 52 types of flying creatures. Humans come along in the 9th age, born from the brain of a female deity. So these creation narratives, they not only bind us to one another, they also give us a sense of cultural identity. They help parents teach children morality, right from wrong. Trust me, as a father of 2 small kids, I respect that. So, if you are religious and living in the United States, chances are you subscribe to one of the 3 Abrahamic traditions, the religions that trace their lineages through an ancient patriarch named Abraham. All 3 of these faiths share the same creation narrative. The oldest of these 3 faiths, Judaism, on the bottom left here, has a holy book called the Torah. Christianity in the center has the book of Genesis from the Old Testament, and Islam on the top right includes the same creation narrative in the Quran. In this narrative, there is a supernatural deity named Yahweh or Elohim who creates the world in 6 days. On day 1, it creates light, day 2, water and sky, day 3, land, plants and fruit-bearing trees, day 4, the sun and the moon. Day 5 is birds and ocean life. And finally, day 6 is wild beasts, livestock, and humans. So this God initially created the first human, a man named Adam, from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. And then it creates a woman, Eve, from one of Adam's ribs. Yahweh puts them in this paradise, this garden, the Garden of Eden, where everything is perfect, and you can see the lion laying down next to the lamb. Let's see. So the Adam and Eve are tricked by a talking snake, a serpent, into eating a forbidden fruit, and they're cast out of this garden. So that's a very brief summary, but my point is, if you were taught this creation narrative, perhaps as a small child, as I was, I understand that it may still be important to you. And I am not here to judge anyone's beliefs. What I am here to teach you is that this is a creation story, just like the San Bushmen have a story, and the Hindus and the Native Americans and the Polynesians have their stories. Every culture that has ever existed has had a religious explanation for how the world began and humans came to exist in it. This is really part of the human experience. They're important, but these creation narratives are not science. These ideas cannot be tested, nor are they based on empirical evidence. These creation narratives are based on old texts that claim absolute authority. Now I'd like to fast forward to the great ancient Greek philosophers. Plato and then his student Aristotle espoused a theory of forms, where they argued there was this quintessential or perfect form of each animal. This perfect form was eternal, it was fixed, and it represented the blueprint from the mind of a god. Real things in the real world could at best be approximations of these perfect forms. This is important because this Greek idea that species are fixed, immutable, unchanging, is then embraced by the Roman Catholic Church in medieval Europe, as it is consistent with the Creator God from the book of Genesis. By the late 1700s, a century before Darwin, the pervasive view is that species do not change over time, and they were purposefully and supernaturally created by a deity. This natural theology that God is at the center of nature is solidified in an argument made by the cleric William Paley. It goes like this. So suppose you're walking along a beach and you find a watch. Upon careful observation of this mechanical watch, you note it's complicated. It has lots of intricate and interrelated parts like you see here. It appears designed. Therefore, there must be a designer. There must be a watchmaker. So you're walking along that same beach and you encounter a beetle, similar to this Madagascar hissing cockroach, the largest cockroach species in the world that I borrowed from the lab, much to my wife's dismay. So when you look at this cockroach, it's complicated, right? It's got antennas, it's got 6 legs, it's got multiple body parts, all of these intricate, interrelated, moving parts, similar to that mechanical watch. So William Paley's watchmaker argument goes, the complicated watch must have had an engineer, a designer. Similarly, the complicated beetle must have a maker, must have a designer. This watchmaker argument, it still sways those that are not trained in science to this day. So now I want to set the stage with a handful of scientists who preceded Darwin, but whose ideas were dramatically influential for him in formulating his profound idea, descent with modification by natural selection. The first scientist that you need to know is Carl Linnaeus. So Linnaeus is a Swedish botanist who loves to collect species in the Laplands of northern Scandinavia. He develops the scientific system of classification or taxonomy that we still use today, known as binomial, bi means two name nomenclature. Every organism belongs to both a genus, capitalized, and a species. So for example, you may call this a gray wolf or a timber wolf or lobo. Those are all common names, and common names can be misleading. To a scientist, this is Canis lupus. Canis is the genus, lupus is the species, whereas the coyote, which we know very well here in Phoenix, is Canis latrans. Same genus, different species. So Linnaeus didn't see it, but Darwin did. The reason why the wolf and the coyote are so much alike that Linnaeus put them in the same genus is because they share a recent common ancestor. You need to be familiar with George Cuvier. So he was a French naturalist that's often referred to as the founding father of the science of paleontology. So Cuvier was the first to extract and describe and catalog fossils. In doing so, Cuvier realized and published that many species that he was recovering from the fossil record were no longer around today. They were extinct. Curiously, some of these species extracted from the fossil record didn't really have any modern day analogs. They were very different. Some of them look like chimeras, this mythical mishmash of different species. Consider Archaeopteryx or ancient wing, recovered in 1861, just 2 years after Darwin publishes On the Origin. At first blush, you look at this and it appears to be a bird. So clearly, it has feathers. You can see the feather imprints in the fossil record. But I ask you, do birds have teeth? Do birds have long tails made up of many vertebrae? Archaeopteryx clearly has feathers. You can see those feathers in the imprint clear as day, just like this modern day owl feather. Archaeopteryx also has a bill filled with teeth, just like this Louisiana alligator. So it has a bird characteristic and a reptile characteristic. If we look at a skeleton of an extant bird, a bird from today, this is a rock dove, right? A pigeon. And you can see that its bill has no teeth. There is not a bird alive today that has teeth in its bill. Further, Archaeopteryx has a long bony tail with lots of vertebrae. I'm going to grab Athena from our lab and we'll see if she'll cooperate. She is a leopard gecko And she's going to be a little squirmy here. But the reason why I like to show you Athena is because you can clearly see this long tail, right? She's got a bunch of vertebrae after her hips, posterior to her hips. There's Athena. Can you say hi, sweetheart? She's got really beautiful eyes. Okay? But a long, bony tail, that's a reptile characteristic. And let's look at the dove skeleton one more time. And you can see that it does have a few vertebrae posterior to the pelvis, but they are very, very reduced. So Archaeopteryx is what we call a transitional species. The birds evolved from a lineage of dinosaurs known as the theropods, small meat-eating dinosaurs. And so Archaeopteryx represents a transitional form. It's part dinosaur and part bird. Darwin's contemporary and close friend Charles Lyell published The Principles of Geology in 1830 when he established James Hutton's hypothesis, gradualism hypothesis, that all of the landforms that we see around planet Earth were shaped entirely by slow moving forces that are still in operation today, that can still be observed today. Forces like erosion and deposition acting over very long periods of time. So Lyell measured the rate at which glaciers carve valleys and realized that glaciers move glacially slow. In order to carve out the valleys that he saw that we see today, it would take millions of years. This idea of deep time was radical. During the 1700s and even into the 1800s, the vast majority of people in Europe believed that planet Earth was only about 7,000 years old, based on an interpretation of the genealogy in Genesis. So Adam and Eve begat Cain and Abel, who begat such and such, who begat such and such. If you do the math, then it turns out that the Earth is about 7,000 years. Darwin recognized, as Lyell did, that the Earth was much, much older. The final scientist that I want you to be familiar with on this week's assessment is Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, a French naturalist who popularizes the idea of evolution. Remember, evolution is the idea that species change over time. And Lamarck is the first scientist to propose a natural mechanism by which evolution occurs. So he got it mostly wrong. He thought that evolution occurs within the individual based on the principles of use and disuse. So consider this giraffe skull. So Lamarck argued that the individual giraffe evolved during its lifetime. The individual giraffe was born with a relatively shorter neck. And then as it stretched that neck up, reaching high into the trees, reaching for higher and higher leaves, because it used that neck throughout its lifetime, that neck became progressively longer. And then that individual giraffe passed on this slightly longer neck to the next generation. So when you think about muscle growth, you could see how Lamarck could arrive at this idea. So because of the coronavirus, I haven't been to the gym in months. And because my muscles are not being used regularly, they've atrophied. So important to note here, Lamarck, with his idea of how life evolved through the principle of use and disuse, was ridiculed for his idea. So the church still largely propped up the scientific community at this time, and those in power did not take kindly to scientists espousing ideas that contradicted church doctrines. So Lamarck, it's kind of a sad story, died penniless and alone. His body was tossed in a lime pit. Darwin surely noticed what happened to scientists who doubt that species were fixed and unchanging. And as you will soon learn in the National Geographic movie, Darwin's Secret Notebooks, Charles Darwin locks his profound idea away in his desk for 20 years before publishing. Charles Darwin. He was born in 1809 in the United Kingdom into a wealthy family. His dad, Robert Darwin, was a prominent doctor. The story goes that Darwin was a sickly child, bullied. He loved nothing more than being alone in the woods, collecting beetles at his family's country estate. I personally feel that he may not have been bullied so badly if his mother hadn't dressed him up in this getup here. That probably didn't help. So at just 16 years old, Charles's overbearing father sends him to the best medical school in the country, the University of Edinburgh, to become a surgeon. But these were the days before antibiotics, the days before anesthesia. So when Darwin first witnessed a poor bloke strapped to a bed get his gangrened leg literally sawed off, Darwin fainted and he realized he couldn't be a surgeon. He couldn't handle the gore. He then enrolls at Christ College at Cambridge University, and in a phenomenal twist of history, Darwin gets his degree in theology in 1831. Darwin wants to become a country pastor, mainly so that he would have time in between Sundays to do what he loved, to collect beetles in the woods. In 1831, Darwin gets an invitation that would change his life and the course of history. The captain of the HMS Beagle, Robert Fitzroy, offers Darwin a job as a naturalist on a 5-year voyage around the world. So this is the tail end of the Age of Discovery, when European sailors were exploring and looking for trade. Darwin's job, his role on the Beagle, was to collect and record specimens from all around the world. This was his dream job. I'm not going to go into detail about the journey because you're going to watch a wonderfully vivid film that traces his path. We are going to fast forward to the Galapagos Islands. Here, Darwin observes species that resemble those on the mainland of South America, but have clearly changed. So consider the neotropical cormorant, which you see here on the upper left. So we can find this species here in the Phoenix Valley. They're super abundant down at the Basin Meridian Wildlife Area down at Tres Rios. So on the mainland of South America, Darwin observed that these birds have long, powerful wings and are quite capable of flight. But in the Galapagos Islands, these cormorants have these tiny little stubby vestigial wings, and they're completely flightless. You have to remember the Galapagos are volcanic in origin. They arose from the sea, so there was no way mammalian predators could get to that volcanic island. The Galapagos have no foxes, no bobcats, no predators for the cormorant to fly away from. Wings and flight are energetically expensive. And if there's nothing to fly away from, long wings do not help the birds survive and reproduce. Everywhere he looked, he saw species that appeared to have changed. The iguanas, an arboreal or tree-dwelling species on the mainland in the jungles of Ecuador, here had become aquatic. They were marine iguanas who could swim and dive down and graze the algae off of rocks. Darwin couldn't believe it, and the story goes that he took an iguana and tossed it into the water repeatedly just to observe it swim. Let us not forget the giants, the Galapagos tortoises, big enough for Darwin to ride on their backs. These tortoises had unique shells depending upon the islands on which they lived and the height of the plant communities. Darwin returns to England a scientist. After reading Thomas Malthus's essay on populations, he carefully describes his theory, descent with modification by natural selection, in a collection of notebooks, which he then locks in his desk for 20 years. In 1858, Darwin receives a letter from a young swashbuckling collector named Alfred Russel Wallace, who had been collecting in Indonesia, and he noticed that the plants and the animals abruptly changed when he hopped from one island to the next. He went across what is to be known as Wallace's Line. The tree kangaroos replace the primates. So this is an area where two plates are colliding. Wallace independently outlined Darwin's idea by observing the biogeography in Indonesia. Darwin gets his letter. He'd been scooped. Darwin was appalled. So his good friend Charles Lyell brokers a joint presentation with both Darwin and Wallace, presenting the idea. The presentation goes largely unnoticed. However, in 1859, Charles Darwin publishes On the Origin of Species, and the foundational underpinning of the modern science we call biology is born. I hope you've learned something in this lecture. Thanks for your time.